That night, I wandered alone on the quiet streets of a small town in Tennessee, unfamiliar and silent. My family had just moved from Chicago because of my mum's job, and this was my first week at a new high school. I didn't know anyone. Everything felt strange and lonely. The hardest part was lunchtime, when all my classmates already had their own groups. I didn't dare start a conversation with anyone, and every time I passed the crowded tables in the cafeteria, I only felt more isolated. By the third lunch break, I decided to be braver and try to find an empty table. But unfortunately, all the tables were occupied. Finally, my eyes settled on a table in the corner of the cafeteria, where only 2 people were sitting. They seemed quieter than the other groups, less intimidating, so I gathered my courage and asked if I could sit with them. They looked at each other, then one of them nodded. When I sat down, I realized they were twins, looking calm and approachable. They introduced themselves as Alex and Blake. Both had dark hair, sharp eyes, and soft voices. Throughout that lunch, Alex and Blake invited me to hang out on Saturday night. They said there was an amazing spot on the outskirts of town, where there was an abandoned campsite in the woods. At first, I was hesitant, but thinking that this could be a chance to make friends, I agreed. That evening, Alex texted me, reminding me about our plan on Saturday, and sent the location of the campsite. The place was about a 20-minute walk from my house, near a desolate area I had never ventured to before. On Saturday evening, it got dark faster than I expected. I checked Alex's message again to make sure of the location. As I neared the campsite, I noticed the atmosphere felt strange. The area was eerily silent, and the pale moonlight filtered through the trees. I turned on my phone flashlight and carefully made my way along the dirt path. When I got close to the spot Alex had sent, I texted them to ask if they were there yet. Alex replied that they were waiting on the other side of the forest, where an old abandoned cabin was located. I followed the narrow path into the forest, filled with hesitation but kept going. The ground was slippery, and branches occasionally scratched at my jacket. I started calling out Alex and Blake's names, but no one answered. Not long after, I heard footsteps echoing back. At first, I thought it was Alex or Blake, but the footsteps grew faster and more intense, approaching me from behind. A wave of fear washed over me, and I turned around. All I could see was darkness, but the footsteps continued. In a split second, I felt cold hands grab my neck from behind, with nails digging deep into my skin. I struggled, and amidst the chaos, I heard a guttural voice coming from the darkness. "Hold it, hold it." In a state of panic, I struggled with all my might and managed to break free from those hands. I started running, sprinting through the forest with my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could still hear the footsteps chasing me, fast and heavy. Reaching the edge of the forest, I ran straight toward the main road leading home, not daring to stop. When I got home, I told my mum everything. She wanted to call the police, but I convinced her that I would report it to the school on Monday. The next day, I decided not to go anywhere, and my mum advised me to block Alex and Blake's numbers. They were also concerned about whether those 2 knew where I lived, but I assured them they didn't. The next night, while I was sleeping, I suddenly felt the air in my room become cold. A draft swept through, making me shiver. When I opened my eyes, I saw my window was wide open, even though I had shut it tightly before. I wondered if my mum had come in to open it, but the chilly night air didn't seem like a good reason for the window to be open. I closed the window and went to my mum's room, knocking on her door. I asked if she had opened my window. She looked at me with surprise and said she hadn't. She and my dad came to check my room, but nothing seemed out of place. I returned to my room, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, but when I looked again, I noticed that my door was slightly ajar, instead of being fully open like before. A sense of unease rose within me, and I stepped toward the door, gently pushing it to look through the crack. That was when I froze, unable to believe my eyes. Behind the door, a tall figure stood, silent and terrifying. I screamed for help, and my dad rushed over immediately. The door slammed shut, and by the time he burst in, the stranger had jumped out the window and disappeared into the darkness. My dad ran outside but found no one. We called the police and reported the entire story, from the encounter at school to the incident in the woods. The police investigated, but they found no clear traces. They advised us to lock all doors carefully and consider installing security cameras. Even though there was no evidence, I still believed that the person was one of the twins I had met in the cafeteria. After a few months of living in worry and fear, nothing similar happened again. Looking back, I didn't understand why I had so easily agreed to follow two strangers into the woods at night. It was a foolish and risky decision. Perhaps from the first moment I saw them, I should have realized that they were not the kind of people I should have befriended. To this day, whenever I think about it, I still feel a chill. One winter afternoon in 2019, I was in my final year at a small high school in Vermont. That day, we had our last physical education class, and our regular gym teacher was on leave. Instead, we had a substitute teacher, a man who appeared to be around 50, with a sharp face and stern eyes. He called out each student's name for attendance and paused when he got to me, his gaze intense and scrutinizing. I felt a bit uneasy, but quickly brushed it off, thinking he was just confused. After taking attendance, he divided us into groups to play basketball and left the gym, leaving a few students and basketballs scattered on the floor. We played casually for a while until the bell rang, signaling the end of class. I grabbed my bag and headed to the girls' locker room to change before heading home. When I tried to open my locker to get my things, I realized that the combination wasn't working. I tried my usual code a few times, but it still wouldn't open. Finally, I stepped outside to find the substitute teacher and asked for help. When I told him, he asked me to wait outside his office while he retrieved the combination book. A moment later, he came out, holding a thick book and with a cold look in his eyes, opening to a specific page. He led me into the girls' locker room, which surprised me, as I didn't expect him to go inside. At that time, the locker room was fairly empty, with only a few students preparing to leave. The teacher tried my combination, but it didn't work. After each failed attempt, he would look at me with a slight smile, a smile that made me feel uncomfortable. He placed his hand on my shoulder and assured me he could solve it. As his hand slowly slid down my shoulder, I felt genuinely unsafe. I pulled away from his hand and said I needed to leave right away to catch the bus. Finally, he tried the combination again, and this time the locker opened. He smiled and walked away. I sighed with relief when he left the room, and as soon as I heard the door close, I quickly changed. Just then, the lights went out, making me jump. The room was engulfed in darkness, except for a faint light coming from a small window above. I hurriedly stuffed everything into my bag, put on my backpack, and headed for the back exit of the locker room to avoid walking past the main door, fearing he might be waiting there. As I rounded the last corner of the lockers, I glanced to the right and saw a shadow standing in the darkness, with sharp eyes staring directly at me. Horrified, I recognized the substitute teacher, hiding behind a locker, revealing only his face and his terrifying gaze. Without thinking twice, I bolted out of the locker room and into the cold, pouring rain outside. On my way home, my heart pounded incessantly, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. When I got home, soaked and scared, I felt too embarrassed and anxious to tell my parents. I convinced myself that maybe I was just being overly sensitive, but deep down, I couldn't forget those haunting eyes. A few weeks later, during an extracurricular class in the afternoon, I saw the substitute teacher again. This time, he was teaching visual arts, one of the elective subjects I took for an easy grade. The class was held in an art room in the basement, an area rarely visited, because it was hidden behind the main row of classrooms. As soon as I entered the class, I felt an ominous and eerie atmosphere hanging over the room. He assigned us some simple drawing exercises, and I sat in a corner, trying to finish my work as quickly as possible. While I was drawing, I heard soft footsteps outside the classroom door, and suddenly, the lights went out. The entire room was plunged into darkness, and a chill enveloped the space. I tried the light switch near me, but it didn't work. Filled with anxiety, I got up and decided to go outside, but the hallway was also pitch black. Suddenly, from the end of the hallway, I heard a strange sound like something heavy being dragged. The noise grew louder, and then I saw a dark figure moving in the faint light at the end of the hallway. The figure stopped and seemed to be looking in my direction. I turned off my phone and hid in a nearby storage room, trying to remain as quiet as possible. My heart pounded as I sensed someone entering the room. The dark figure slowly moved towards the corner where I was hiding behind an old wooden table. Peeking through a small gap, I saw in the dim light that it was indeed the substitute teacher, his eyes glinting in the darkness. He stopped, looking around as if searching for something, then suddenly called my name. My heart raced wildly, and I closed my eyes, holding my breath as lightly as possible. After a few seconds, he seemed not to notice me and turned to leave, closing the door behind him. I waited until his footsteps faded away, then bolted up the stairs, left the basement, and found my supervising teacher to recount the entire incident with short, gasping breaths. After listening, my teacher looked worried. She immediately called security to check the basement, but when they returned, they reported finding no one, only a few items that had been moved. The next day, I was called to the principal's office to recount my story. The principal listened intently, promising to investigate and take action if necessary. From that day on, I never saw that substitute teacher at school again. As time passed, the incident gradually became a haunting memory, no longer affecting my daily life. However, I could never forget that man's eyes, the gaze that sent chills down my spine. In the summer of 2015, my two best friends, Alex and Jamie, and I decided to go on an adventure of a lifetime. It all started when Alex heard rumors about an old abandoned school deep in the woods on the outskirts of town. It was once a high school, and after it closed in the 90s, it became a mysterious place with many ghost stories about students still lingering there. This made us unable to resist the curiosity, and we decided to explore the school on a weekend night. We prepared our gear carefully: flashlights, fully charged phones, and even Jamie's handheld camera to record every moment of our journey. Although all three of us were nervous, no one dared to show fear. The school was about a 30-minute drive from the town center, and most of the journey was on rough, rocky roads through a dense forest. When Alex's car stopped by the roadside, we saw the old school building faintly illuminated under the moonlight. The school's facade was covered with vines, and the windows were completely shattered. The surrounding atmosphere seemed to carry a sense of gloom and chill. We got out of the car, checked our flashlights, and began to head towards the main entrance of the school. Unexpectedly, Jamie noticed that a window on the ground floor was still wide open. After a quick discussion, we decided to climb through that window to get inside. Alex went first, then Jamie, and finally, me. Once all three of us were inside, we realized that the school looked even scarier than it had from the outside. Moldy walls, narrow, endless hallways, and not a sound except for our footsteps. We split up to explore different areas. Alex and I stayed together while Jamie went to the left wing of the school to look for the infirmary. We could only hear the echo of our footsteps and the wind whistling through the broken windows. Our flashlights illuminated part of the hallway, but thick darkness still surrounded us. Alex and I went deeper into a room labeled Classroom 3. Inside, we saw rusty beds and dusty, scattered tables. While I was looking around, Alex suddenly said, "Hey, did you hear that?" I paused and listened. Yes, there was a faint clinking sound from the far end of the room, like dragging footsteps. We held our flashlights tightly and slowly approached the area, but saw no one. Thinking it was just our imagination, we continued exploring. When we left the room, my flashlight suddenly flickered and went out. Alex chuckled, saying maybe the battery was low, but neither of us wanted to admit we were feeling scared. We managed to turn it back on, and this time it worked. But right after, we heard a faint voice calling from afar, "Alex, Matt." The voice was soft but clear, and we both recognized it as Jamie's. We rushed in that direction. When we arrived, we saw Jamie standing in a large infirmary, empty and with old bloodstains on the floor. "Did you guys see anything?" Jamie asked, his face tense. We shook our heads and recounted the story about the footsteps and the sudden flashlight outage. Jamie said he felt like someone had been watching him since he entered the school, and he kept hearing faint whispers, not sure if it was people or the sound of the wind. We decided to leave the school as fear was beginning to take over. But just as we turned back, Jamie suddenly jumped and shouted, "Look!" I turned around and saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a man dressed in a school uniform with his head bowed. All three of us froze, and before we could react, the figure vanished behind a corner. No one dared to linger any longer, and we immediately ran towards the window where we had entered. But when we got there, the window was shut tight, as if someone had locked it from the outside. Alex tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. Panic started to spread, and I wondered if we were truly trapped inside this school. We decided to look for another exit down the right hallway. Trembling as we walked, Jamie suddenly heard footsteps behind us. We turned around but saw no one, just pitch black darkness. "Run," Jamie shouted. All three of us sprinted towards the end of the hallway, where there was an emergency exit. When we arrived, we found the door wide open, but outside it was pitch dark. Without a second thought, we rushed outside. Once we had escaped the abandoned school, we didn't stop, running straight into the woods until we were completely exhausted. After catching our breath, we looked at each other, knowing that none of us would ever dare to return. We could only look back at that school, where a figure appeared at an upper window, pressing its hand against the glass, watching us leave. At 16, my family and I moved from a bustling city to a small town in New Hampshire. My parents believed that the fresh air and quiet environment would be better for our lives. But for me, transferring to a new high school halfway through the year was not easy. On my first day at the new school, I felt like an alien among a crowd of strangers. The students there seemed to be close-knit, and it looked like everyone already had their own friends and groups. On my first day in biology class, I sat in an empty seat near the window, trying not to attract attention. The class started, and just a few minutes later, the door opened. A boy walked in, holding his books and looking a bit awkward. The teacher motioned for him to introduce himself. His name was Dean, and his voice was soft, yet somewhat strange. Dean was different from the other students. He seemed quiet, a bit withdrawn, and barely looked anyone in the eye when speaking. I was surprised when Dean made his way to the back of the classroom and sat down in the seat right next to me, seemingly the only one left. During the lesson, we were required to pair up for an experiment. Having no other friends in class, I had to pair with Dean. He didn't say much, only giving brief answers when I asked, and his demeanor made me feel uncomfortable. But I thought he might also be new and need time to fit in, so I tried to keep the conversation going. After that day, Dean seemed to take an interest in me. He didn't miss any chance to sit near or walk beside me in the hallways. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. But then I noticed he always showed up quietly wherever I went, from the classroom to the library, even in the cafeteria during lunch. Although I felt slightly uncomfortable, I still chatted with him politely. Dean mentioned he was an only child and had recently moved here with his parents from another state. When I asked more about his family, Dean seemed to avoid answering and quickly changed the subject. Von, Bun, MCC Hun. Gradually, Dean's presence became excessive. Not only did he always show up by my side, but he also frequently texted me whenever we weren't together at school. One night, I received a message from Dean asking if I wanted to go out for a walk. When I declined, he continued asking about my hobbies, routines, and even my family. Although I didn't want to answer in too much detail, I replied politely, not wanting to cause any misunderstandings or hurt his feelings as my new friend. Then one day, at lunch, I was eating with my new friends, Emma and Jackson. Suddenly, Dean appeared and sat right next to me without asking. He started sharing strange stories about his family life, nightmares, and unsettling experiences he had. My friends and I felt awkward, and Emma tried to change the topic, but Dean didn't seem to notice. He continued talking about things that made us uncomfortable, and we didn't know how to respond. After lunch, Dean sent me a message asking if I could meet him privately to do homework. I found it strange because Dean was actually quite good at school subjects. I replied that I was busy and had to go home right after school, but Dean didn't give up. He kept messaging me persistently, as if he was trying to force me to meet him. Then one Friday night, while I was watching a movie in the living room, Dean messaged me again, asking if I was at home. At first, I thought it was just a casual question, but his next message startled me. "Your living room lights are on, aren't they?" My heart pounded as I looked out the window and realized that Dean was somewhere outside my house, watching my every move from the darkness. I texted back, "What are you doing?" But Dean only replied with a short message, "Just wanted to make sure you were home." A feeling of unease began to creep over me, and I immediately closed the windows and turned off all the lights in the house, hoping he would leave. But shortly after, I heard a soft knocking on the back door. My heart raced as I realized Dean was outside, showing no intention of leaving. I didn't dare open the door. I just stood silently in the living room, listening. Then, I heard light footsteps moving around the house, as if he was trying to find a way inside. Unable to take it anymore, I ran upstairs and called my parents, telling them everything. They advised me not to open the door and promised to come home right away. While waiting, Dean kept texting, asking me to come out and meet him. "Why are you avoiding me? I just want to be friends." His message made me feel more terrified than ever. When my parents arrived home, Dean had already disappeared. My dad immediately asked me to block all contact with him. My mum, worried about my safety, decided to report the incident to the school the next day. On Monday morning, I met with my homeroom teacher and recounted everything. The school quickly contacted Dean's parents and requested that he stop bothering me. Since then, I haven't seen Dean at school, and I heard that his family moved elsewhere. A month later, I began to feel more at ease. The events with Dean gradually became a haunting memory but faded over time. Until one night, as I was about to go to sleep, my phone alerted me to a message from an unknown number. The content was a single line: "I will be back." The slanted text, unsigned, but I knew exactly who the sender was. My heart was filled with worry and unease. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. When I was 17, I moved to live with my aunt in a small coastal town in Oregon, after my family faced difficulties. As it was the middle of the school year, I joined the local high school feeling quite unfamiliar. It was a small town, so the school was also small, and everyone knew each other. On my first day at school, I realized I was the only outsider in the class, while everyone else seemed to have known each other for a long time. My aunt had told me that this town had some mysterious stories, especially around the school. But I didn't think much about it, simply because it didn't interest me. On my first morning, I had a biology class. As I sat down near the window, I noticed a strange-looking student sitting far away from the others at the back of the class. He seemed silent, with his face always turned down. When I introduced myself to the teacher, he looked up and stared at me with dark, intense eyes that sent a shiver through me. After the class ended, I accidentally ran into him in the hallway. As I was about to walk past, he came closer and started a conversation. "Hi, I'm Logan," he said, his voice soft but slightly hoarse. "I'm Max," I replied, trying to be friendly. Logan gave a faint smile and invited me to tour the school. Since I didn't know anyone else, I thought this would be a good opportunity to get familiar with the new place, so I agreed. He showed me around, pointing out classrooms and the gym at the back of the school. The more time I spent with him, the more I noticed that something seemed off about him. At first, Logan asked me normal questions about where I used to live and my hobbies. But then he started asking strange questions, like my home address and my family's daily routines. Feeling uncomfortable, I answered vaguely and made an excuse to leave. The next day, I tried to avoid Logan, but he somehow always seemed to know where I was. While I was in the library, he unexpectedly appeared beside me and sat down, looking quite pleased. "We could be best friends," Logan said. Although I didn't want to disagree, I just forced a smile, hoping he'd understand that I didn't like being bothered. As time passed, Logan's presence began to feel more unsettling. He texted me constantly, even at night when I wasn't at school. Once, around midnight, I received a message from an unknown number. "I saw you at the gym today." Although I knew it was Logan, the feeling of being watched gave me chills. I decided not to reply, and for the rest of that night, I couldn't sleep. The following night, as I was getting ready for bed, Logan texted again. This time he wrote, "I stood outside your house for a while. I just wanted to see you." Fear crept into my heart, and I checked the window to see if anyone was outside. There was only darkness, but something gave me the eerie feeling that he really had been there. The next morning, when I arrived in class, I saw Logan sitting at the back, staring at me intensely as if he could see right through me. I avoided his gaze, but as I walked past his desk, he whispered, "Tonight, meet me at the beach behind the school." There's something interesting. Not wanting to cause any trouble, I just nodded to brush it off, but I had no intention of going to the meeting. That evening, I told my aunt about the situation, but she said it might just be a misunderstanding and that Logan probably just wanted to make friends. However, I felt that things were not that simple. Later that night, Logan continued texting, asking if I had come to the beach yet. I replied that I couldn't make it because I was busy studying. He stayed silent for a few minutes before texting again. "That's a shame, you should have come." Attached was a photo of the moonlit beach, with the shadow of someone standing there waiting. A chill ran down my spine, and I blocked his number, trying to forget the whole thing. However, just a few days later, a strange account on social media sent me a friend request with the name Friend from the Sea. Although I didn't accept it, I still felt uneasy, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Another evening, when I went out to the backyard to take out the trash, I felt something was off. When I turned back, I saw strange footprints on the ground, leading from the fence straight to my bedroom window. Filled with fear, I ran back inside and locked the door tightly. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from the strange account. "Nice footprints, right?" At that moment, I had no doubt anymore Logan was truly watching me. The next morning, I decided to report the entire story to the school. The principal listened and checked the student roster, but the result left me stunned. There was no student named Logan in the school. I froze, not knowing what to do when the principal said that Logan had never existed in this school. From that day on, I tried to avoid all the places where I had seen Logan, but the messages from the Friend from the Sea account kept appearing regularly. The last message, just before I left the town to return to live with my parents, is one I'll never forget. "No matter where you go, I will find you."